right, welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donnie Badinsky, and in this video, we are going to be focusing on Lucy and the Australopithecines. I am going to offer what I believe is the superior explanation for Lucy and the Australopithecines in general. The points that I am going to be mentioning throughout this video are largely related to the recent article that I published on Patreon and also on our main website, standfortruthministries.com. And Matt and I are also currently reviewing it and hoping to publish it as a truth and research entry in our truth and research division of the ministry. Now, before I start going over some of the points that I laid out in my article, I do want to mention an important point about arguments that are agnostic. And so in the world of creation versus evolution, what you'll find are a lot of arguments being used by proponents of evolution that are mostly agnostic to the overall debate on ancestry. And what I mean by that is this. If I were to argue in favor of creation, and I were to say, well, creation is true because the sky is blue, or creation is true because the earth is round, the evolutionists would say, well, that's not evidence. That's not good evidence for creation, because we can also explain why the sky is blue and the earth is round. That is not discriminatory evidence. What it is it's non-discriminatory evidence, where both models, as a matter of fact, many different models can explain this kind of data. For example, if we had the multiverse, let's say DC Comics and Marvel Comics, let's say what they put forth in terms of the multiverse was true. And we've got Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3. Let's say on Earth 2, evolution's true. Earth 1, creation's true. Well, there are many lines of evidence that on Earth 2, where evolution is true, if there was a creation hypothesis on Earth 2, creation could still account for that data. And the same thing applies to Earth 1, where creation is true. Evolution could still account for a lot of the data. For example, evolutionists love to look to homology. These homologous patterns in the biological world, these shared structures. Homology also applies to genetics, where you have similar sequences, let's say, shared between humans and chimpanzees. There's also the existence of nested hierarchical patterns, where humans and chimpanzees are a lot more similar in terms of genetics, morphology, anatomy, and physiology than, let's say, humans and monkeys, or humans and banana plants, or humans and fish. There's this natural nested hierarchy in the biological world. Now, these arguments are largely agnostic, because both creation and evolution can account for homologous patterns. For example, human engineers design in homologous patterns. Why shouldn't God? That's good design. Evolutionists would argue that homology is due to common descent with modification, that these structures were inherited from past common ancestors, and of course those structures over time are modified. That's where you get descent with modification. So they would say that these structures don't have to be nearly identical, because they've been modified, they've altered over time through evolutionary change. The same thing applies to nested hierarchies. Of course, humans and chimpanzees, since they look a lot more similar, are going to share a lot more in terms of genetics than, let's say, humans and a dog, or humans and fish. It also turns out that human engineers design and build in nested hierarchical patterns, where a sedan is a lot more similar to a hatchback than a sedan is to a van, or to a boat or a skateboard. And so human engineers design in nested hierarchical patterns, and they're not doing this to prove creation. They're not doing this to provide evidence for creation. It's good design. And so these are basic points on the importance in the ongoing evolution debate, creation versus evolution debate, to focus on what's called discriminatory evidence. These are arguments or lines of evidence that only one model can account for. And that's why in my presentations and debates, Matt and I just recently did a 4.5-hour debate seminar with conspiracy cats. We like to focus on arguments that the evolutionist side has no good or convincing rescue device for. For example, the Y chromosome dissimilarity between humans and chimpanzees. To this date, the evolutionary community, guardians of common descent, they lack any real good counter to that point that when you consider overall architecture, size differences in gene content, the Y chromosomes, which is paternally inherited DNA passed down on the father's side, it's for the most part non-recombining. And so in many ways, it should be less messy because it's not biparentally inherited DNA where you have recombination every generation, the shuffling of these genetic variants. And so the Y chromosome, for many reasons, could have been more similar between humans and chimpanzees, but overall they're less than 30% the same. We also like to focus on these mutually interdependent systems here. One example, DNA repair enzymes in DNA. It is said that in a single cell in a single day, we can experience up to 1 million DNA breaks. And we have roughly 60 trillion cells. Well, that's incredible. That's millions and millions of DNA breaks every single day. But thank God we have these incredibly designed DNA repair enzymes that fix a lot of these DNA lesions. Now, of course, they don't work perfectly. We live in a fallen world, and that's why we do pass on mutations every generation. In autosomal biparentally inherited nuclear DNA, the mutation rate is roughly 100 new mutations per person per generation. And that's fast because, as we know, the majority of those mutations are nearly neutral. Selection can't see them. Therefore, they're subject to genetic drift, and they result in the genetic sickness of species over time. And so that's genetic degeneration, which is a challenge to the evolutionary community. And the problem for the naturalist is that when it comes to DNA repair enzymes, the information for the DNA repair enzymes are actually encoded in the DNA. So you need the DNA repair enzymes to fix a lot of these DNA breaks, or else we couldn't survive. We'd go extinct after a few generations. But you also need the DNA because you need the DNA to code for the information that is the DNA repair enzyme. So what came first? Well, if the naturalist says the DNA, well, you need the DNA repair enzymes to fix a lot of these DNA breaks. And you can't say the DNA repair enzymes because the DNA repair enzymes are encoded within the DNA. And so there, for example, is a mutually interdependent system. They both had to come into existence at the exact same time. Their appeal to the unobservable past and these unobservable proto-cells that they appeal to in debates, that's just evolutionary philosophy. Those are not empirical, those are not answers based on real empirical evidence. Anyways, I've done entire programs on this. We've discussed the nature of discriminatory versus non-discriminatory evidence many times before. I just did a whole video focusing on the chromosome 2 fusion argument and why ultimately the fusion argument doesn't really matter. Now, this is a setup for what I will discuss here on Lucy, because what we know about Lucy and the Australopithecines is largely agnostic to the overall debate. Now, evolutionists like to look to the features or aspects of Lucy and Lucy's kind, or the Australopithecines in general, that suggest they were bipedal, were able to walk upright, or had a form of bipedalism. And I'm here to tell you that whether or not they did, it's agnostic. It doesn't do much to advance the debate because the creation side could also account for that same data. And so what I want to do with that setup out of the way is share screen and go over a few things here. I'm trying to keep this video to about 30 or 35 minutes. This video is not meant to touch on every single point because, well, firstly, we'll start here. If you go to the channel and go down to my most recent community post, settling the Lucy debate. What was Lucy? Was she an evolutionary transition, or was she perhaps a human pygmy? And so Chris Rupe, he promotes the pygmy human hypothesis. And of course, this is not an attack on Chris or any creationists. This is simply moving the science forward in the best way possible. Examining arguments. This is what we should do to strengthen arguments, to figure out what is a good explanation and what's a not so good explanation. And I've tested a lot of different arguments over the years. I've done over 100 formal debates. I've done hundreds of impromptu, open mic, informal debates. And so I've seen firsthand what arguments work and what arguments don't really work. And I believe, and I think we've demonstrated this. We've done an entire series with Dr. Peter Line, comprehensively examining the hominin fossil record. And Peter Line joined me recently for a roughly 4 to 4.5 hour seminar. It might have actually been closer to 5 hours on all things human evolution, including the out of Africa theory. But he gave one of the most extensive and information-packed presentations you'll ever find addressing Lucy and going through Chris Rupe's hypothesis that Lucy was a human pygmy. And so I do highly recommend people check out those seminars, as well as his presentation answering the Lucy question. And so again, it's important that we utilize the best arguments, and at times that requires critiquing each other within the world of creation, critiquing our models that we're putting forth. And so you can see the Patreon article here, and you can also access it through the website. And I wanted to go over a few of the more significant points. And so, is Lucy human? Well, a major challenge to the idea that Lucy is human is that a lot of the features that you would look to, and so Chris has looked to several features, one of them being the anterior inferior iliac spine. And I got a whole section here in this article on that, suggesting that Lucy, based on its pelvis, is human. The problem is other Australopithecines and non-Australopithecines as well, like Ardipithecus ramidus, have those same features that evolutionists would say, like, for example, with Ardi, they argue that Ardi, let's say its pelvis is mosaic, a mixture of features closer to, let's say, chimpanzees, but other features closer to humans, because they would say that a creature like Ardi is basically on the way to becoming human. But the problem is, for the pygmy human hypothesis, is you find the anterior inferior iliac spine, for example, you find that in other Australopithecines, such as Littlefoot, Australopithecus prometheus. Now here's Littlefoot's skull, clearly an ape, clearly an ape-like primate. Here are several Australopithecines, including Australopithecus sediba. But for this video, I want to focus on Lucy, which is AL288-1. And then Australopithecus Prometheus is STW573. And so a lot in common, a lot of similarities in the hip. The anterior inferior iliac spine is present in Lucy, in Littlefoot, but also Ardipithecus. And so the question for those that want to argue that Lucy is human, is Littlefoot also human based on that criteria? Because I think we can all agree that Littlefoot is not human. Now, another major issue is you could not argue that Littlefoot is a mixture of species. And I have a few points here that I think are important to emphasize. Littlefoot has a pelvis very similar to Lucy's. Both species exhibit features suggesting a degree of bipedalism. I'm going to show very soon here why bipedal non-human apes or ape-like primates is agnostic to the debate. It doesn't preclude creation by any means. Littlefoot is found largely intact, with fewer gaps in its fossil record compared to Lucy. Actually, some have said that Australopithecus prometheus, or Littlefoot, is the most complete Australopithecine individual that we have, which is fascinating. Littlefoot is 90% complete. The skull is clearly connected to the body, the postcranial material, while Lucy's skeleton is only about 40% complete. Littlefoot has a skull that is clearly ape. Its skull is connected to its body. It cannot be argued that Littlefoot is a mixed species. So you could not argue, well, Littlefoot comprises multiple individuals, and so the lower half featuring the pelvis is a human, but much of the upper body, such as the skull, is ape. Well, it's all connected, so you wouldn't be able to argue that. Since Littlefoot is clearly ape and its pelvis looks very similar to Lucy's, is Littlefoot human? Now, here's the issue. When we're putting forth a model or a hypothesis, it is important that we do our due diligence and address the major challenges to it, because it has been said that all it might take is one experiment or one observation to prove me wrong, to refute me. Perhaps there's a dozen observations that are supporting my model, but then one that precludes that model from being true. That one is enough to refute the entire model. And so for the pygmy human hypothesis to be true, what needs to be addressed are these major challenges. Is Littlefoot a human? Is Littlefoot a non-human? If Littlefoot is non-human, which I think it clearly is, then what does that mean about the features in, let's say, its pelvis that are looked to in Lucy's pelvis to say Lucy is human? Now the argument from Lucy's hip is unpersuasive, because from my understanding, Chris Rupe, and I do appreciate his work on many different topics. I just think there's some problems here with this model that need to be addressed. And I'm open to it being true. I don't think it is because of these challenges. I've argued for it in the past. I've done an entire discussion, a live discussion with Gutsy Gibbon. And because I am involved in a lot of debates, I'm involved in the debate community. If I am utilizing an argument that simply doesn't work, there's too many holes, well, then I see that it's not a good idea to use that argument. And we want to use the best possible and most up-to-date arguments when engaging the critics, because we don't want to give them any reason to take advantage, because that's what they like to do, is take advantage of weaker arguments. And so because these challenges involving Littlefoot and Ardipithecus ramidus and others are problematic at this point, it's not a good idea to advance a position that says Lucy is human, because it's my understanding that proponents of this view, one of the major reasons why they're arguing for Lucy being human is to avoid a young earth creation model in explaining hominins that involves bipedal non-human apes or primates. But if one were to say, well, Littlefoot is ape, an extinct ape-like primate, but Lucy's human, well, then you're still forced to say, okay, but Littlefoot had a form of bipedalism, was able to walk upright in some way. So it gets rid of that motivation, because now you still have to deal with other creatures that are non-human that apparently have a form of bipedalism. Here's an interesting point that I wanted to showcase. Littlefoot and Lucy, both Australopithecus afarensis, have, now I've noticed there's even some in-house debate in the conventional literature on these issues, but I still wanted to highlight some of what's being said here, have similar pelvis structures. But Littlefoot's pelvis is more complete and allows for a more detailed comparison with Lucy's. Both have a platypeloid, which is short and broad, pelvis shape, unlike modern humans, with Lucy's pelvis being more transversely oval, according to a study here. This suggests a unique birthing mechanism for these hominins, but the point that I wanted to focus on there was this point about Lucy, where it says both have this specific pelvis shape, unlike modern humans. And so some have actually argued that Littlefoot's pelvis has some aspects to it that are more human-like than Lucy's. But if we are going to look at traits such as the anterior inferior iliac spine, so notice this. The anterior inferior iliac spine is a feature unique to hominids, which includes humans and their relatives. Specifically, it's a bony projection on the ilium, which is part of the hip bone. And we have Ardipithecus, which apparently shows the anterior inferior iliac spine. some of the Australopithecines like Sediba, Africanus, and Lucy, but also Littlefoot. And I think the Littlefoot issue is a major problem that needs to be addressed. And so going back to my article here, I do have a picture where you can compare STW 573 to Lucy to see the similarities. And okay, I'd recommend people read the details of this. But one thing I wanted to highlight was a point that Chris made in a recent interview. And so I will share screen again, but I want to make sure that the audio is on. So this was a question regarding potential objections. And again, this is the importance of putting forth a model, but addressing the major challenges that might preclude your model from being true ahead of time. Because you could have 50 different points in favor for your model, but if there's one or two challenges that model can't account for, well, then you're going to have to alter that model somehow, or just completely discard it and look to something better. So let's have a look here.
I do want to know. So, you've talked about biblical creationists, and they're still thinking on this. At least that you told us that before we started recording.
The creationists that are thinking on it are those that are familiar with, for example, as Dr. Peter Line presented, they're familiar with these contradictions where you have Littlefoot and you have the pelvis of Littlefoot that is very similar to Lucy's, that is very similar to art. I'm not saying they're exact, but those traits are present that Chris would look to and say, because of these, then this must be a human pelvis, and therefore the creature or the individual that has that pelvis must be human. Is Littlefoot human, or is Littlefoot an ape? But if Littlefoot is an extinct ape or ape-like primate, well, what does that mean for the pygmy human hypothesis? These need to be interacted with. And so that's why creationists that are familiar with these points, that's why they are hesitant to accept this model. And so I know myself, I'm curious to see how Chris would engage that and analyze these points in a sophisticated manner.
But what is the secular, what do evolutionists say about your research and what you've come out with?
Well, I haven't engaged them on it yet, and I'm sure they're
okay.
Putting...
And this is just constructive criticism, but this is the problem, is a lot of these points and arguments, they've been out there publicly for years now in the world of YouTube and debates, at least 2 to 3 years. And so before putting forth this as a superior model, let's deal with the objections. Let's deal with the challenges. And I'm not talking about an objection that might just be agnostic or something that doesn't overturn the bigger picture. No, these are points that are bigger picture points. And so these need to be engaged. And we need to see if the pygmy human hypothesis can stand up in debate or discussion or in light of criticism. And if I remember correctly from this video, I don't even think Chris, and again, this is nothing against Chris. We're just critiquing models. We're discussing scientific models because we here at Stand for Truth believe in model building. And model building does require looking at objections and criticisms and challenges. And in light of those, we either refine our model and we come out with a better model, or we reject the model and move on to another more scientifically supported model. But I don't think he mentions Littlefoot in this. But that's a major challenge that should be, especially if a proponent of the pygmy human hypothesis wants creationists to use this argument, argue in favor for it, let's say in presentations or debates or talks. Well, they need to be equipped by Chris with answers to these objections or challenges. Because when I chose to argue in favor for this in discussions a year or two ago, and informed critics such as Gutsy Gibbon brought forth these challenges, it was in those moments that I realized, okay, this pygmy human hypothesis it has problems, it has issues, and so those problems need to be engaged. But if a creationist that is not familiar with those challenges moves forward and argues positively for this hypothesis, but they're unfamiliar with these challenges, they could be caught off guard. And so I think it's Chris's duty in many ways to equip creationists that he feels that he's motivated to have them argue in favor for this position. He should be equipping them with rebuttals to these potential challenges.
Video together to challenge it, but I suspect that where they will go is they'll look to other fossil findings to kind of corroborate their view that there are true.
I'm not, perhaps he'd have to clarify. I'm not 100% sure what he means by suspects, because this isn't a novel prediction or suspicion that he has, because he knows that these arguments exist. These challenges have existed for years. So it can't be the case that he's saying, well, I predict they're going to say this. Well, no, he already knows what they've said. Many of us have brought forth these challenges to him. Dr. Peter Line on my channel gave a very technical, comprehensive response. He examined this hypothesis in detail. And so these challenges have been known for a while. And so it's not Chris predicting that that's what critics of his model would say. It's the fact that critics of his model have already said this. And these criticisms have been known for at least a couple years.
Human-looking, from the neck down creatures that lived in the past. And they might cite Ardipithecus' hip, for example.
So where he says human-looking, he's saying Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, is human-looking. If we were to just really be basic here, human from the Lucy from the neck down looks very human. Look at the hip, look at these features, look at the anterior inferior iliac spine. But wait a minute, again, Littlefoot apparently has those same human-looking features from the neck down. This isn't demonstrating evolution. I'll get to that soon. So does that mean Littlefoot is human? That's something we need an answer for. Because again, you can't argue that it's multiple individuals. You certainly can't argue that it is human based on the skull, or else now we have Planet of the Apes going on. So the point is these need to be addressed. And we'll engage the point here on Ardipithecus soon.
Example, which by the way was so poorly damaged that the researchers described it as roadkill. So if their best comparison is something called.
But here's the problem. Even though it's damaged, you can still make out these features. You can make out the anterior inferior iliac spine. And it also turns out, so I cite this section of this video to address one of Chris's responses to the Artie point. Artie's pelvis may have been, now again, I'm open to these different models and explaining hominins. I think we have the superior explanation here, which would be the explanation that people like myself, Matt, and Dr. Peter Line are putting forth. I think Dr. Peter Line has the most balanced view of the hominin fossil record. I think he does an excellent job. We've now had our series out for over a year, comprehensive 10-hour series addressing all things hominins, and we've had no serious counters from the critics. And we know it's a full-time job here countering the critics. And so the fact that even the best of them have not adequately or sufficiently countered our series with Dr. Peter Line on hominins tells me that it's a strong position. Now, they do like to take advantage of models like this, are arguing that Lucy is a human pygmy, because there are challenges that haven't been addressed yet. And so here I point out, now again, I'm open-minded and open to these various models, but I need to see these challenges addressed. And to me, this is kind of a hand wave. To address one of Chris's response to the Artie point, Artie's pelvis may have been roadkill, but even Lucy's pelvis was severely damaged. But that's his main focus here, is Lucy. It appeared to be crushed or broken when discovered. Regardless of the state of Artie's pelvis, we can still make out its features, and they closely match that of Lucy's pelvis. Does this now mean Artie is also human? But let's just say Chris and other proponents of the pygmy human hypothesis were to ignore Artie or discard it because it was considered roadkill. That doesn't do anything to change the fact that Littlefoot exists. So what is Littlefoot? How do you address Littlefoot? highly complete, the most complete Australopithecine out there, with features below the neck that are very similar to features in Lucy below the neck. Now, when you have the skulls of these Australopithecines, very easy to tell that these are non-human ape-like creatures. There's also the various features in the hip and other parts that we can look to. But when you take a holistic approach, when you have enough material, that's when you can really tell, okay, this is human and this is non-human. Have a look at this. This is kind of interesting here. Whose hip was more damaged, Artie or Lucy? Lucy's hip was more severely damaged than Artie's. Well, that's interesting. Lucy's skeleton shows evidence of a significant fall with a shattered pelvis and damaged knee joints. So both had to be reconstructed. There was a lot of artistic license put into both. I'm not saying they weren't reconstructed accurately. I'm just saying, arguing that Ardipithecus' hip or pelvis was too damaged or battered to get any good data from. I'm not personally convinced by that point. And the key features are present that tell us, okay, the pelvis in many ways was very similar to both Littlefoot and Lucy. In contrast, Artie's pelvis, while showing some damage, indicates muscle attachments unique to bipedal locomotion. And so again, is Ardipithecus a human? So far, the model is incomplete. And that is my encouragement, and other creationists as well. Our encouragement to Chris and proponents of the pygmy human hypothesis is to engage these challenges. Okay, so what is the superior explanation for Lucy and the Australopithecines? Well, there's a lot of interesting points here. Firstly, contradictory to the evolutionary explanation for the Australopithecines, there are discontinuities in anatomy and morphology that evolutionists have failed to account for. I'm going to go through at least one of those. If we had their genetics, I would predict that there would be major discontinuities there, major dissimilarities, just like we see today. These dissimilarities that we see in, let's say, the Y chromosome, we don't have, unfortunately, the genetics of these Australopithecines to make those kinds of assessments. But if we do get good DNA, worthwhile DNA in the future, then we can see if that prediction is true or not. And so I want to go over a couple points here and also address the bipedalism. Perhaps we'll start with the bipedalism. The features of Australopithecines, such as Lucy and Littlefoot, are a non-issue. Peter Line and I, we showed a video of gibbons, which walk upright. They can run upright, very similar to humans. As a matter of fact, it's interesting because one might say this is a contradiction to the nested hierarchy, because humans and gibbons are a lesser ape. Okay, your great apes would be your, of course, evolutionary taxonomists argue that humans are a great ape. But you've got chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans. You do have lesser apes like gibbons. And it turns out that we as humans have more similarity with gibbons in terms of upright walking than either do with chimpanzees and the other great apes, even though we apparently share a more distant common ancestor with the gibbons. Supposedly chimpanzees are our closest cousin and we share a close relationship with them. It is said that we and the chimpanzee go back to a common ancestor roughly 6 million years ago. So when it comes to bipedalism, we have extant apes, non-humans, that are bipedal. And one might find it odd. So the Bible is completely silent on whether or not non-humans, primates, could be bipedal, walking upright. I mean, one would think it's odd that animals that have 2 legs, but yet humans are the only ones that are able to walk upright on those 2 legs. It makes sense that God would have a variation of designs like we see in most things. And so notice this. For example, gibbons, a lesser ape, are bipedal primarily due to adaptations for arboreal feeding and locomotion within their forest habitat. And we know that environment dictates morphology in many ways. And there's a lot of morphological adaptability built into each kind, design diversity. We've seen in real time rapid adaptation. We know we have millions of genetic switches just waiting to be turned on in response to environments. Not that these are being built up due to beneficial mutation accumulation over time, but that these abilities to adapt rapidly to new environments are built in, are front loaded. And so after the flood, what we would have is rapid speciation, rapid adaptation to these new environments, these new habitats. And so it would make sense that you may have during that period of time, you'd have upright walking non-human primates. But in the same way gibbons walk upright but still in a different way or different form than humans, then it wouldn't be a surprise that extinct non-human ape-like primates or apes would also have a form of bipedalism. That's why it's agnostic to the overall debate. Apparently, gibbons are more bipedal than any of the great apes. This means that humans and gibbons have more in common in terms of upright walking than either does with the great apes. And so I pointed that out. Dr. Peter Line has an excellent article here where he covers more details on the nature of gibbons and their bipedalism. But he has an excellent section here where he discusses non-human primates outside of your main human lineage, your evolutionary lineage, where you've got Ardipithecus to the Australopithecines to Homo habilis, erectus, and eventually Homo sapiens. You've got these creatures that are already bipedal. But as far as I understand, they're not argued as being a transitional form. So notice this. Another real blow to the idea that bipedalism equals hominin is that fossil apes / primates in Europe were built for some form of bipedalism, yet are not regarded as hominins. For example, Tracy Cavell described an extinct great ape as having mosaic features, such as forelimbs suited to life in the trees that all living apes, including humans, still have, lower limbs suited to extended postures like those used by orangutans during bipedalism in the trees, and further specialization of such features of the lower limbs in humans to enable habitual terrestrial bipedalism. Here's a specific example that's supposedly 11 to 12 million years old in the evolutionary timescale. That would mean that bipedalism existed millions of years earlier than the first supposed hominin. So it just sounds like a good variation, a good design in the biological world, having really nothing to do with your ape to man evolutionary story. Now, it's agnostic because evolutionists can account for it. They require some form of non-human bipedal ape, but it's not a point that evolutionists can't, or that creationists can't account for or explain or make sense of. Hence, why would bipedal features in the Australopithecines from Africa mean they were hominins? Here's another point I wanted to show. Lucy's gait. So even though Lucy and these Australopithecines would have had a form of bipedalism, what's interesting is the conventional literature supports the idea that their form would have been different, just like today gibbons walk upright. They can even run upright, but their form of bipedalism is distinct. It's different from humans. This is variation in good design. Notice this about Lucy. The cross-sectional area of Lucy's lower back vertebra, particularly the lumbar and sacral vertebra, are also extraordinarily small, suggesting that they were not adapted for the bearing of heavy loads associated with fully upright postures, which would be like us as humans. So there's differences there. And notice this comparison of the pelvis. Adult modern human female pelvis replica above the cast of Lucy's. So this is Lucy's. This is human. The white arrow would be the ilium. Note the smaller cross-sectional area of the body of Lucy's sacrum compared to that of human. So you can see this comparison here. Human at the top, Lucy's hip at the bottom. Just comparing the two, you can see enough difference to show why Lucy does not have to be considered a human. Suggesting it was not built. So not built the same way we are as humans, different design, to bear the heavy loads associated with obligatory upright walking and or a fully upright posture. And so they would have been bipedal like your gibbons today, okay, but a different form of bipedalism. Probably more of an awkward kind of walk if they don't have the build required to sustain the ability to bear heavy loads associated with full-time upright walking like us as humans. And so that was an important point that I wanted to showcase. Also, there's been work done. This is from New Creation blog on statistical baraminology. Okay. And these baraminological analyses based on continuities and discontinuities, these studies have actually shown separate ancestry. These Australopithecines belong to their own group with these discontinuities. Gorillas and chimpanzees, I would argue gorillas and chimpanzees are two separate kinds. Y chromosome gives us good evidence for that. And then humans. And so the clustering tells us that the Australopithecines, although have some similarities, what even you find in the conventional literature is that Australopithecines are distinct from both extant apes like humans or like chimpanzees, and then also distinct from humans. They're their own unique extinct primate kind. Yes, there's some similarities, but also dissimilarities. And apparently, based on these studies done by people like Dr. Todd Wood, and this is an article from Peter from Paleologos, we can visualize this distinction in a multi-dimensional scaling graph, like you see here. From graphs like these, we can see that humans form their own distinctive cluster. And if these studies were not coming out this way, let's say these weren't the results, then those doing this kind of baraminology, these assessments would not be reporting this data. They would be coming forth and saying, well, the data looks consistent with evolution. And so we need to do further work and we need to continue model building and find these distinctions or boundaries. But no, it turns out that the results are exactly what creationists would expect to find. Australopithecines fall into their own cluster. I mean, you can see the clustering. The gap between the Australopithecines and humans indicates that these groups are separate or discontinuous. If the Australopithecines were our ancestors, we should not be able to detect. So this is real science right here. This is a good study, statistical study. Detect such strong separation between them and the earliest humans. Overall, the Australopithecines are too different from the earliest humans to have been directly ancestral to them. Great points, great study. In my article, I talk about the hyoid bone. That's a good example because even in Neanderthals, do Neanderthals have hyoid bones like humans? Yes, Neanderthals do have hyoid bones similar to those of modern humans. So the shape and design of our hyoid bone helps with our amazing ability to speak. But it turns out that the hyoid bone in Australopithecines is more similar to chimpanzees and gorillas. That is amazing, which is why I want to cover this part. An example of a trait dissimilar enough in humans, chimpanzees, and Australopithecines to separate them into different groups is the hyoid bone. This impressively designed bone plays a crucial role in speech. It functions as a foundational structure. So rather than bipedalism being a trait that we need to look at to identify what it means to be made in the image of God, our ability to speak and to communicate and music and design things and invent and love, these types of traits that transcend Okay. It's interesting that your Australopithecines have a hyoid bone more similar to creatures today like chimpanzees that don't have that amazing ability. But bipedalism, it's agnostic to the overall debate. So we should not be overly committed to a position that says, hey, we can't have non-human bipedal apes or ape-like primates because it doesn't really matter. And today, we even have extant lesser apes like gibbons that if you go watch a video and observe how they walk or run, they do so in an upright manner. They are bipedal. And so we should not look to bipedalism as being a trait indicative of being made in the image of God. As in, like, this trait makes us made in the image of God and no other creature can have that trait. That's what I mean by that. And so here, it functions as a foundational structure for the tongue and the larynx. This enables the specific movements required for speech production. Chimpanzees have a hyoid bone with a distinctive bulge called a bulla that is not seen in humans. This bulge attaches to air sacs in the larynx. Humans do not have a hyoid bone with a bulla. The only known hyoid bone in extinct Australopithecines. So this could have been a prediction. Imagine the hyoid bone found in the Australopithecines. There's limited of them, but imagine the one we found had a similar shape and design to modern humans. Oops, I'm sure the evolutionists would have loved that. But this is what I mean about the kind of dissimilarities in morphology and anatomy, and of course genetics, but we don't have the genetics of the Australopithecines that can help us to answer the question of ancestry and draw lines in species, these boundaries between kinds, what is and what isn't related. This bone shows an extension for laryngeal air sacs. The only known hyoid bone in extinct Australopithecines differs from the hyoid bone of humans for laryngeal air sacs, suggesting they vocalized more like chimpanzees than humans. The fact that the hyoid bone in Australopithecines, based on this single find, is more similar in shape to those found in chimpanzees and gorillas is a major challenge for those who believe in human evolution. Where is the evolutionary progression from a non-human primate hyoid bone to what we see in humans that gives us the ability to talk? This sequence doesn't exist. Guardians of common descent lack evidence for this important transition. These fossil record discontinuities are exactly what biblical creationists would expect to find if separate ancestry were true. And I want to go over the conclusion here. You can also read it over on the Patreon account. The best response to Lucy and other Australopithecines is not the pygmy human hypothesis. In the future, it may be worth revisiting this model as a superior view of Lucy if and when these major challenges to it are addressed and not ignored. Perhaps Chris, and if there are any other proponents of this model, perhaps they have some really good responses to Littlefoot and these challenges that we're not aware of yet. And so if that's the case, then it'll be worth revisiting. But at this moment in time, unfortunately, it does need to be rejected because these are challenges that preclude the model from being true. These are some major inconsistencies and contradictions. When putting forth a scientific model, it is of utmost importance that major challenges are addressed. All it takes is a single experiment or observation to prove us wrong on a position we may be putting forth as a valid model to explain data. If we fail to address those observations, we have not done our due diligence to defend our position in a convincing manner. Of course, that applies to any model and anybody putting forth a model, including evolutionists. The best explanation is also not the evolutionary one. As we've seen, there's some dissimilarities there. There's some major challenges. And the point that they look to as being fulfilled predictions of evolutionary theory are ultimately agnostic, because creationists can also account for those observations and those pieces of evidence, because they don't preclude evolution or creation from being true. We want to focus on discriminatory evidence. It's actually going to help answer this question of origins, a piece of evidence that only one model can explain and the other can't. Or the other has to invoke a really far-fetched imaginary rescue device where we say, okay, that's not very convincing. There are far too many problems, such as fossil record discontinuities, with the human evolution explanation for the Australopithecines. It is truly the biblical creation model of ancestry that offers the superior explanation for these extinct but interesting creatures. And I want to wrap it up there. I don't want this to be too long of a session, because what I'll do is recommend for those that want to dig deep, take a deep dive into these issues, check out the entirety of this article that I put out. Have a look at this comprehensive examination of the hominin fossil record that Dr. Peter Line and I have done, including our latest seminar. You're probably looking at a good 12, 13 hours worth of content. So very comprehensive. Have a look at Dr. Peter Line's article here on Lucy. Lucy at 50 has not aged well. You can also read this article here by Peter B. And you can have a look at the section here dealing with the results of their bareminological analyses. And so there's a lot there if you want to dig deep and continue looking at these issues. But at the end of the day, overall, it's agnostic to the overall debate, whether there exist non-human, bipedal, great apes, lesser apes, extinct ape-like primates. It doesn't matter. Okay, both models can largely account for the data. Even if evolutionists want to say, well, this is a fulfilled prediction, it's what we needed, it doesn't mean creationists can't account for it. And so what we need to focus primarily on to advance the debate in a meaningful manner are pieces of evidence that are discriminatory. Pieces of evidence, let's say an argument that I put forth that actually precludes evolutionary theory. And then the evolutionists should want to do the same thing. And pointing to some extinct bipedal apes or ape-like primates with mosaic features and with features that allow them to walk upright, that's not going to do it in terms of providing us with the kind of evidence that will actually preclude the creation and separate ancestry. And okay, I hope everybody enjoyed this video. God bless. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys soon.